So hello, and a very warm welcome to today's conversation with Scott Smith. This event is one of a series of informal lunchtime events that Nesta's been doing with artists, writers and activists. My name is Celia Hannon, and whilst I've had the pleasure of hosting some of these sessions already, I probably ought to declare an interest in today's topic because I lead the team at Nesta, which is tasked with applying the tools of futures to our work. So before I actually introduce Scott, I'd like to cover the format of this session. Scott and I will kick things off with a chat for the first 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open up to your questions and comments. So I'd like to strongly encourage you to put your questions into the Zoom question box from the very beginning. If you've got something in mind now, there's really no need to wait until we finish talking. So on to today's speaker then. Scott Smith has more than 25 years worth of forecasting experience. As a founder of the firm Changeist, he's consulted on futures for everyone from UNICEF to the New York Times. He brings a distinctly international lens, I think, to his work. So he's worked particularly intensively in the United Arab Emirates, where he helped to devise the strategic foresight program for Dubai's Future Academy. So in his new book, How to Future, Scott, I think, has really pulled off something of a rare feat. It's a book about futures which is both practical and accessible, and that is certainly not always the case. He and his co-author, the sci-fi writer Madeline Ashby, I think you feel that they really wanted their readers to be able to go out and actually be able to do futures in their organisation. So it's in that spirit that I will be asking Scott to keep his responses as grounded in real world examples as possible, and I know he's got lots of those. So welcome, Scott. I'm afraid I am going to have to start with the elephants in the room, plural. So here we are, midst of a global pandemic, on the day of an election which some people think could pitch the US into a democratic crisis. What is it like being a professional futurist when it can feel like we're actually living inside some kind of dystopian scenario?
Thank you, Celia. Thank you for the invitation to be here. That's a big question. I think the short answer is noisy, busy. There are a lot of big things happening all at once, as you say. We're sort of looking over the edge of a cliffhanger or two or three at the moment, and so it's quite challenging in some ways, but it also, in the sense that there are a lot of factors to be paying attention to be weighing. Different audiences and different kind of constituencies. You're not just looking at the factors that are changing, you're also looking at the way the systems respond to those changing factors. But I think it also really speaks to the need to have at least a notional structure, a kind of scaffold that you can hang these events and these issues and these trends and forces on to be able to make sense of them, rather than trying to kind of swat them away or just shut all the information and coming down. So yeah, a tricky day.
And I imagine the most infuriating question of all as a futurist is always, being asked to predict something or other. And actually there are a set of tools which would be very much the wrong tools to reach for from the futures toolkit during a time like this. But are there things that futures can do for us that really is a very helpful service at periods of such uncertainty?
Yeah, there really are. I think that one of I tend to kind of look at this tool set or these methods as having a couple of key benefits. One is, in a practical sense, the ability to identify and kind of map out in a grounded sense, what are the different possible pathways ahead? And what are the kind of forces and interactions that might change or alter those pathways? Which directions could things go, rather than just making it a binary of utopia, dystopia, or on, off, or this person versus that person. Being able to get a bit more nuance and detail and kind of mapping pathways forward. So the sort of developing a sensible forward view is one element. I also think that it's quite important to be able to use these tools to understand better, to understand what you know, what are the kind of elements that you have a lot of information about or good insight on, and what are the things that you don't know that much about, and why don't you know them? Where are those kind of dark spots on the horizon in terms of a kind of lack of knowledge or obscurity, and what's causing that? We tend to, as you say, prediction, people tend to think this is about just shooting an arrow, throwing a dart and hitting a target and being right or wrong. But really, it's much more about uncovering and understanding how things are working and what that might tell us about the future.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to turn now, if I may, to the starting point of your book, and that's the idea that the future itself as a kind of concept has become almost commoditized. It's essentially being packaged and sold to us on repeat by all these different corporate actors. So whether it's the HSBC posters and airports or Apple products.
Yeah.
And I think you actually use this term future washing in the book. And actually, despite all of this, people at an individual level feel relatively disempowered. They don't feel that they actually have the capacity to be able to, as you say, anticipate or respond to the future often. And reading between the lines, I get a feeling that, the book and your role here is about essentially trying to reclaim that process of futuring from corporate marketing. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's quite fair. It's that those messages, I mean, while they're important to obviously project the visions of the corporations or the organizations or the entities who are sending them, and even at a kind of pop culture level, it's there's that kind of aspect of kind of using the future as a slogan to, give a nod to the youth, to, kind of express who's empowered. All of those things really do, in a way, kind of package it and move it away from us. I've used a term over the past 5 or 6 years, Flatpack futures, the idea that that sort of pre-constructed narratives of how the future should be, whether it's sort of shiny and chrome, it's on Mars or on the moon, if it's some amazing new technology, all of those images, while they are useful in some ways, if they become sort of too kind of too large and too all-encompassing, it actually takes our agency away from us. And so this kind of having it on repeat all the time in kind of popular culture messaging, I think, gives us almost the feeling that we can kind of sit back and be a passenger to the future. And if anything, the last 6 months have shown us that that's clearly not the case. We can't just go along for the ride.
I'd like to move now to talk about foresight in an organizational context. So as a sort of function or even a team, it's gone in and out of fashion in organizations. I think it's fair to say, stretching way back to the 1950s. And you point out that actually organizations are now very much waking up to this need to embed it, not necessarily just in standalone teams, but as a sort of distributed capacity. I think you talk about the term nervous system as an organization. But actually, future is very much about dealing in uncertainty. And actually that's not very compatible, is it, with the type of leadership that we embrace, and particularly in places like the UK. How do you resolve that kind of tension, do you think?
It's a really important question. I mean, as you say, the function has kind of come and gone. I mean, we've seen every 6 or 7 years there's a new wave of futures, agencies, departments appear and then disappear. And one of the kind of great ironies of all of this is that often the first thing to lose budgeting and headcount is the more forward-looking prospective part of an organization. We'll see groups spend time building up a team and then cut that because they feel like they need to be looking at the here and now, when actually they're sort of taking away their own sensory capabilities. And I think there's a couple of critical things here. One is, if you have it only as a single function somewhere else in the organization, it is quite easy to cut the supply line to say, well, that's a budget line item, we can get rid of that. So there's an organizational aspect to it, but I think also there's a responsibility, or back to that term agency aspect of it, that, if you think, for example, about something like sales and marketing, most organizations, would kind of say, in air quotes, All of our staff are, represent the company and the brand. Everyone's in sales or marketing. Everyone should actually has a point of view about the future, whether they've articulated it or not. And I promise you, we've been to so many organizations where we might have someone involved in a workshop or a meeting or session that's not in their job description, but I guarantee you they have insight about what may be coming. They have points of view about what's favorable and preferable. And they probably have a way of articulating it if they have the right language and the right kind of channels to do that. So I think, even as we're kind of, we see organizations more and more distributed now, the need to take advantage of that intelligence and kind of insight gathering and sensing on the periphery has never been greater. And I think you can balance that with, yes, having a vision or a North Star or a kind of direction to go, but always be taking in that intelligence and information about what's changing.
And it's interesting, isn't it, just kind of looking at how the COVID crisis has actually wrong-footed leaders who try to project that absolute certainty, and you get someone like Jacinda Ardern who responds in a very different way and arguably more successful way. So you were talking then just about how you embed that capacity within organisations. I think you do a very nice, straightforward job of just demystifying and unpacking what the stages are of the futures process. And I'm sure there are lots of people on this call that are familiar with them, but I wonder if I can ask you to just unpack those different stages so we share a common language in the rest of the discussion.
Sure. So the kind of identification of those phases really came about, by looking back at years of work that we had done. And regardless of the question or the scale or the time frame that we were working in, we found that we were still kind of stepping through similar phases of understanding and communication. And so we talk about these initially as one that gets very underappreciated as a kind of framing or scoping phase. It's easy to send out an RFP and say, we want to understand the future of X. But, while we might understand the common definition of X, whether it's healthcare, mobility, or food, or whatever it's going to be, the future of is a heavily loaded, section there. What does future mean in this context? And for whom, to whom, from whom, and all of these sorts of aspects. So being able to frame your considerations are really critical up front. Then kind of going through a sensing phase. We talk about this as scanning and sensing. There's a term that many people probably are familiar with, the horizon scanning, which is more of a technical description of an activity of looking for new information, detecting signals, identifying trends that are important. But I think we needed to get beyond just the technical aspect and talk about it as sensing in terms of something that's ongoing and active. So the intake phase, if you will, of any investigation or exploration. Once you've sensed and scanned for information, making sense of it, looking for patterns, mapping it in ways that are appropriate and that can help you wring new insight out of that information is the next phase. Then being able to take what you've discovered and turn that into a narrative that can transmit from me to you, from the people doing the exploration to others. So in terms of a scenario, and scenario can be defined in a lot of ways, but how do you tell stories basically about particular futures? Then stepping from that storytelling into a prototyping, how do you actually engage other people through making parts of that future real? And that could be in a kind of low fidelity, very basic form in ways that engage other people and drive conversation and debate. And then the final piece is being able to look back at all of that and ask, did we use the right tools? Did we look in the right places? Did we talk to the right people? So a kind of backwards looking assessment so you can adjust the next time you go through that process with a different question.
And I wondered if we could take a minute just to dive into that first stage in a tiny bit more detail, because I think one of the problems in terms of the general perception of futures often is a sort of is often a semantic one, because a lot of the terms which are used are also in common parlance, but they have specific meanings in the context of specific meanings in the context of futures. So within that horizon scanning strand, key things that foresight professionals are often looking for are signals and trends and drivers. Can you unpack what the difference is between those and why they're so important in terms of weaving together that picture of different scenarios?
Certainly, I can give you a definition from our perspective. One thing we've tried to do in the book is kind of walk a very fine line of giving a kind of the characteristics of those, while recognizing that different organizations are probably still going to use variations on terminology. That's just the way things are, and organizations inherit language from each other. So kind of starting at the base level, we talk about signals and weak signals, and you could think of these as data points in a quantitative sense or a qualitative sense. Where are there small kind of elements of change, things that you're noticing, whether it's, it could be a piece of data, it could be, the performance of a company or a change in behavior, or it could actually be a phenomenon or an event, a new product that's introduced, a subtle shift in language. The small things that the more I kind of describe them to you, the more you probably realize you notice them all the time. Little differences. And those little differences at that point are probably still untethered or unconnected to something. But one of the reasons you notice them is because you have a sense that there may be something important here. There may be something you can attach that to. This is a behavior change connected to a use of a technology, or it's a policy shift that is in context of something larger. Those weak signals over time may aggregate into a trend, several data points in a series. So a trend is really an expression of change over time. Probably is the most basic way to think about it. Where is something shifting, and how can you describe that using a verb? Hopefully, X is increasing or decreasing. Things are happening more like this than that. There's a trend towards working from home. People are, relying more on small interfaces for information. You can think of thousands of them, but trends tend to be those things that are more than a few instances. And I would tend to think of them as being greater than a year in duration and probably shorter than a decade. And I say that because you can have trends that are sort of really fast and cyclical, like fashion, things that go in and out of use really quickly. So if it has a duration, that's important. If it's longer than a decade is kind of a benchmark, then we start to think of it as being more of a driving force or a driver, sort of interchangeable terms. So things that are much more embedded characteristics of a system. We talk about these in the book as being kind of glacial. They move slowly. Things like demography, population change in most cases doesn't happen overnight. Absent a conflict or an asteroid or something. But it builds up over time, and it actually has a very long, slow shaping force on other things. Baby booms and generational change make things happen slowly over time. And those driving forces are we think of them as kind of being deeper level or higher level, depends on your mental map. And I think if you can kind of understand those three elements and how they feed each other, that driving forces might reinforce trends, trends can reshape driving forces, etc. You start to get a common language, so that when we're in a meeting together and you say, well, there's a trend towards X, and I say, all right, in my mind, I have an understanding of what you're describing to me. We can communicate very abstract ideas and still have a general sense of the shape and form of what we're talking about. And that's quite critical, because you can be talking past each other or trying to kind of backfit or retrofit or hack other people's terminology in, and it doesn't always work, and you might have critical misunderstandings along the way.
Thanks for that, Scott. I think that did a really nice job of, I think, bringing to life the detail of something which can sound quite abstract to people sometimes. So I'm going to skip over a few steps in your features process and land on the storytelling stage.
Yeah.
And that's really about kind of often fabricating actual objects which conjure up visions of the future that people can then actually see or touch. Mm-hmm. And I think I'm always reminded of that quote. I'm not sure if you've heard it, which is about good sci-fi and how it should help us to domesticate the incredible. And I think good features sometimes does that, and often you know, the design piece as well. Can you tell us why, from your point of view, this is such a critical point of the process, the storytelling bit? And can you give people a couple of examples where you've done it in an interesting way, or you've seen others do it?
It's, you know, the scenarios and kind of storytelling as a form came about really back in the 1950s. And, you know, we were trying to transition from how do you tell a story from a printout of computer data that's a simulation about something, to communicating something that people can understand on a human scale. And, you know, humans as a species, we tell stories. We tell stories as a way of being sort of using stories as containers for complexity. And stories are really great ways of helping put other people in the frame that you're exploring. And so those stories can take a lot of different forms. Normally they be kind of written narratives, a short story or 4 or 5 paragraphs to help someone understand the critical pieces of a particular future. But in the past, I would say, decade or so, we've seen a shift towards materializing stories as a way to reach audiences and help engage people, not just on an intellectual level, which even a written narrative might still do, but on an emotional level as well. And there's been, you know, various research in psychology that shows that people can engage and respond better with something that's tangible to them, even if it's imaginary in a sense, than if it's just something they've heard or read. So we use material objects, artifacts, things that people are familiar with, often using forms from their everyday life to help communicate the sort of subtle changes that might happen in a particular future, and in effect, you know, transport people there. So to give you some examples, work we've done a couple of years ago with the International Red Cross, Red Crescent, where as an organization, they had a new strategy document that looks a lot like a lot of other big strategy documents from important organizations, a lot of bullet points and black text on white paper. But how could we make the intersection of some of those bits of strategy real enough that they would engage decision makers to kind of stop for a moment and engage on a kind of empathetic level with the future they were mapping? So one of the artifacts that we developed was a communications kit from a speculative resettlement camp during a refugee crisis, say 5 to 7 years in the future. And it was a way of kind of creating an object from that space that you could center a conversation around. Why is it here? What technology is it using? Who's operating it? In this case, it might be the Red Cross, but it might also be Amazon. That actually throws up some really interesting strategic issues. How are we using it? Are we using it to give people individualized protection and access in this resettlement process? What are we trusting and not trusting? And so by creating it and sort of setting it in, you know, it was on a table with the high-vis vest of the worker sitting on the chair, log sheets of people they had just received, a half-empty cup of tea. You're sort of transported in that moment to the space where this future is actually occurring. So it creates a kind of atmosphere and an empathy that connects people to an abstraction. Actually, we've done some work with Nesta in the past year on imagining future community emergencies and how different civic organizations or community organizations might step forward and become more resilient in responding to those. And we, using some grounded research and workshops, created 5 different scenarios and different situations with specific kinds of community responses, different organizations that were being built from the grassroots up, and how they might face different emergencies. And looking at that, we were able to explore in a more tangible way things like guerrilla health workers. There was actually a group called the Bevanistas that were kind of operating outside the NHS, but operating in ways that they could get into people's into communities and actually collect really critical health data. Now, this was pre-pandemic, but it helped us kind of almost do service design and explore how those organizations might engage someone face to face, down to the level of a leaflet, of the signage and the livery and everything else.
Thank you. There's some really fascinating examples, and that leads me on to something I wanted to ask from the perspective of someone who is watching this. Perhaps they're part of a grassroots charity or a smaller one, and they're thinking, well, futures just sounds like it's something which is a nice to have. It's for resource-rich corporates. How would you make the case to them that this is actually something that smaller organisations and communities can use to make them more resilient?
I've literally just been on a session this morning before this call doing exactly that with a community group in the UK. The most critical thing at a time when community organizations are most necessary and also have the most kind of fragile resources to work with. But one really critical resource, which is, people's will to come to each other's aid. That those resources have to be protected and effectively future-proofed. You still want to be able to set out a plan or an ambition or a goal or a mission that's achievable. And some of these tools are for more kind of complex work, but often they're really can be put to basic use. We can use tools like backcasting, which is what we were doing this morning, to help a community group set a 1 year, a very short-term future horizon kind of vision or goal, and then work backwards from that to develop the more practical steps they need to get there. They can then map that against the big factors they see operating in their future and put the two pieces together to create a more resilient plan. Those sorts of things, being able to just kind of role play through particular situations, because the most turbulence is being felt by those organizations at grassroots level right now. Exactly. And being able to network and communicate with each other, that's the other critical factor.
No, I think, yeah, that's absolutely right. And for people who are interested in that theme, I'd like to give a shout out to the work done by my colleagues Kathy Peach and Laurie Smith on participatory futures, which builds on a whole body of work that's out there, and people who are thinking about how you take those skills into communities. And this is your 2 or 3 minute warning before we go over to questions. I've been keeping my eye on them, and we've already got 3 or 4 excellent ones. So do pop them in the Q&A box now. So before we go to those, I'd like to ask you about that kind of all important question of who is doing the futuring, as you call it. I know that the futures community has been really reflecting for actually quite a long time about the need to diversify away from that Western kind of homogenous vantage point. And shout out to the School of International Futures for a lot of work that they've done on that. And of course, there's plenty of evidence that it makes for bad forecasting and that homogenous viewpoint. So from your point of view, what can people practically do to avoid that groupthink? And if you've got time, just to thread in any observations from your time working in Dubai, which of course is such a different culture, I'd be really curious to know about those.
Yeah, I think it is a central kind of issue. It's one that we've tried to take on organizationally ourselves, and who we engage and who we hire. We encourage the organizations we work with to have diverse representation on their side, because going back to an earlier point, there's a tremendous amount of knowledge and experience embedded in organizations that's untapped. But most importantly, there are really critical points of view, lived experiences, visions of the future, aspirations, all of those elements that are represented through diversity that are really critical to bring into the picture. And not just kind of do it in a one-off consultative fashion, but to actually keep those voices at the table. Neurodiversity is important because here we're talking about something that very much is based on kind of our mental perceptions and kind of cognition models. So having that diversity of voice is nothing but reinforcing the kind of future-proofing capability. And inviting people into the conversation is really critical as well, because it's their future they're going to be living in. And they like to have a say and some agency in helping construct it. Some of the things that we picked up in the process of, we spent about 3.5 years working in the UAE, is really a reinforcement of something we already knew intellectually, but it helps to experience it. And that's even at a deep level, how different cultures can perceive the future. What is the future? How does time work? What's important? How do they define it? And We use common terms like probable and plausible and possible in futures that we just take for granted, and as native English speaking Westerners, that is clear. Those distinctions make sense. Uncertainty is a kind of concept that has different definitions to it, or sort of different perceptions. So one of the things we really came to understand was, for example, in Arabic, there are two words for future that mean very different things. Mustaqbal being the kind of future that's, the things that are going to come chronologically, and mukbil, if I'm hopefully not mangling my Arabic,
someone will pick us up on that, I
hope. Things that are ordained. And then beyond that, there's sort of different, modalities of possibility, imkaniya, mumkin. These words are very important because they have subtle differences. And if you spent, hours and days working with a group, talking, using certain words that may not match perception, you've missed an opportunity to connect and help understand and learn more.
I'd love to keep asking you questions, but in good conscience, I can't, because I've seen the ones coming in and they are really excellent. So I'm going to turn it over to the audience. So keep them coming. And there's one, it's a very short question, but it reminded me of an interesting part of your book, which I think I've lost it now, but I think it was Thomas, who asks about, how do we make sure that this kind of futuring process doesn't end up just reflecting the standard expectations? And you have a really nice exploration of the kind of question of official futures, and how different industries and companies all sort of tacitly often align around an official standardized vision.
Yeah, I think this is why it's really important up front to do it, kind of lay out your assumptions. How do people define this particular future in this organization or this exploration? What are the assumptions we're making about it? We may actually assume quite different things about it, but no one's actually saying that. Part of the process of futures is it really a kind of social process of opening up and disclosing and kind of bringing into daylight what we actually think as individuals or groups about what's desirable. Sort of calling out official futures. They may still be valid, but can we actually talk about that? Is this really the future we think is still valid? Or is it kind of past its sell-by date? And so being able to question official futures and question the kind of rigidity of them, I think is important. And you can do that in a non-negative way, that kind of with a small c critical, because you're going to end up with a much better outcome if you've checked these assumptions at the beginning of the process.
And there's a really interesting question here from Naomi Davis, which is something that I've been thinking a lot about recently, which is, it just goes back to your point about sort of the nervous system and how you embed these capabilities. Naomi's asking about how does an individual raise observations about, I imagine, the future in a way that the organisation is more likely to take note of or respond to, because she's saying she's quite well connected to the front line and to people in a diverse set of environments, but she's not necessarily a data scientist. So how do we create the conditions so that the organisation can hear those views?
I think for this, it's important to kind of walk before you can run. And by that, I mean the organization, it's useful for it to make space for these conversations. It's useful to start to think about the language that we use and the way you can communicate them. Is there a time and place that's been set aside for those conversations? Because what you don't want to do is kind of make it a one-off random critique and say, well, actually, I've observed this instead of that. There needs to be a kind of a venue or a space to share those ideas. And so it's important that organizations open that up so that Naomi and her colleagues have a way to kind of step forward and say, here's an observation, here's why I think that's important. And really get into the practice of using language and having conversations about the future as a regular cultural behavior. And once that layer is there, I think it becomes much easier and smoother to have regular processes, monthly or weekly meetings and that kind of thing to share insights. And
I think you reflect a bit about the noting the culture of an organization. So if the culture is very data driven, that can give rise to certain blind spots. but equally it means that it's important to adapt and nuance the types of tools that you then choose to use with that organization, such that we've got a nice saying about it, about the post-it and the database.
Right. Not bringing a post-it to a database fight. It's, I mean, in the sense of, I mean, it's a very practical consideration, which is you want to be kind of speaking the language and sort of using the appropriate folklore in a way for the organization. Some organizations are heavily data driven, and you need to recognize that because, you know, there are no facts about the future. We don't have future data yet. All data is almost necessarily backwards looking. So you have to be aware of that and make other people aware of that when you're introducing a qualitative observation that might be quite well grounded into an organization that is quote unquote evidence-based, because we don't have that evidence. So you have to work with what you have to hand.
And Louis got a question again, which is close to our hearts at Nesta and something we think about a lot, which is how you bring together expertise and subject matter experts into futures work, often in tandem with public or practitioners and policymakers. What types of, I'm imagining, practical steps can you take to try and weave together those different perspectives and make use of good expertise?
There are, I guess, kind of tools that you can use that, you know, for collecting expert views at a kind of arm's length, where you're not necessarily bringing those people into the process, but you are framing important questions and taking on board their insights and knowledge and expertise. One of the things that's really important to consider if you do begin to bring experts directly into the conversation is making them aware of what the nature of that conversation is. And by that, I mean, you can take people who spend their days working heavily on evidence-based, you know, quite binary or linear, almost mechanistic ways of working. And then when they're suddenly injected into a very soft, abstract, and kind of interpretive work of futures, that can be a little uncomfortable. And so you can end up with conflict that's not very valuable to either side. When in fact, if you can kind of lay down some basic, not really even ground rules, but just sort of expectations, then they can understand better how to inject what they know, bring that knowledge to the table, and actually take something on board from it.
Yeah, and it's so challenging to make sure that perspective doesn't dominate. You know, it's a kind of leveling, kind of up process that needs to happen. We've got a question looking for a bit more guidance on that last learning phase. So learning from a futures exercise. The question is really about, you know, should that be kind of quite formal? Could it be more organic? I'm going to tag on another bit of this again, selfishly, just from the perspective of how do you then demonstrate, frankly, the impact of a futures exercise? Because it can be quite hard to define, can't it?
It actually really, it can. I'll kind of take that back to, or front to back. You know, in the first response I would give would be, you know, again, whatever is kind of appropriate to the culture of your organization. I always hate to be very prescriptive and say, well, you should be very formal about this and make it regular. But I do think regularity helps because it sets some expectations of accountability. It also sets some expectations that nothing is perfect and you can learn in this process. The best clients we work with are those that realize that these aren't precise tools, but they actually can deliver quite a lot of value. And by always kind of asking what worked and what didn't, that's just good practice for almost any kind of work. You know, it's a standard debrief. To the second part of that around kind of impact and evidence, that's really quite challenging. I have a anecdote in the book where I had to be on a call with someone where they were asking me how many, you know, what percentage of accurate predictions did I make last year as a metric? And it's not really the appropriate question. It's kind of an uncomfortable, you know, weird one in a way, but it's logical if the person on the other end is driven by, you know, quantitative metrics. And I think, you know, often it's the things that aren't happening, the decisions you don't make, the knowledge that gets carried into other projects, all of those sorts of things. Futures work tends to kind of inform and disperse as it goes. So it's often difficult to show, a hard deliverable with, evidence and impact 6 months down the road, a year down the road, but often you'll be able to look 3, 5, 7 years down the road and see subtle changes in course that you might be able to trace back to what you've learned.
Sort of serves as an inflection point in a way.
Yeah, exactly.
A new path was taken. So I'm going to go to a question from Tobias in a minute, but just to encourage people who might be sitting with a degree of skepticism perhaps, or questions around how feasible it is to do this kind of thing, particularly when we're being challenged on so many different threat fronts, resources are thin. I'm really curious to know what you're thinking, so do feel free to throw in some challenge. Tobias is interested in, actually we were talking about kind of that idea of standard features or official features, and often they privilege this idea of continuous growth, continuous progress. And Tobias is asking, how do you have conversations, particularly I guess with corporates, which are about doing less, and the idea actually scaling back slow practices, that might be a kind of a set of options which are less popular but need to be considered.
One of the kind of useful techniques I think you can use here is by actually involving those people directly in the sort of realization process themselves. And I think that's why this is critical as a kind of participatory practice, that you're not just going away and doing some work in a black box and then bringing back a result later that may or may not sit well with the current official future, but actually having those decision makers involved in kind of mapping out what the landscape looks like, so they can see for themselves what decisions might need to be made and what the sort of impact of a growth only future looks like. One of the, it's not just adding to and making new things. And it can often be too much tied into innovation processes just as creating the new. Right. But often it's a case of, what do we take away? What are the actions we don't take? How do we conserve? How do we redirect resources to other means? And so I think, being able to have alternate futures, one with growth, one with degrowth, or no growth, and allowing people to kind of internalize that themselves is quite important.
And in that sense, I guess it's almost been a double-edged sword, that there's been this merging of futures with product design, with innovation, because it kind of, it contributes to the idea that futures is about doing more and, quicker, yeah, and creating more. And on that point, Lewis has got a question about climate change, and how do we essentially use some of these tools to change public awareness? And I think this really speaks to where we started at the beginning, which is lack of agency, a feeling that you're kind of powerless to shape what is happening over the longer term. It's got to be one of the biggest contributors to our failure to tackle climate change, right?
Absolutely. And I think now that that we are clearly within the envelope of impact, climate change is still something we think about as being out there, but it's actually in here, with us. The pandemic is effectively a kind of a symptom of climate change in some aspects, in terms of the kind of complex dynamics of the environment. And everything from sort of the ability to use futures as a way of mapping systems and understanding interactions and interconnections between factors can make it quite useful. But even more so, we still have high levels of uncertainty and unpredictability about how it will manifest in different places and different situations and contexts. Being able to prototype for those different possible futures and allow us to kind of understand materially now what that might feel like. There's a huge emotional space that we're needing to step into, in terms of how are we going to deal with stress, shock, grief, all of those things that we are already experiencing with things like the lockdowns. How can we use futures as a way to help people pre-rehearse for those situations, so that we're more resilient and more capable of facing them when they actually emerge in kind of full form? So I really, in a way, I feel like the systems piece and the prototyping piece are really critical tools for confronting climate change.
Joanna's got quite a long comment and set of observations. I'm gonna split into two questions to you, but it's really thoughtful. The first is about how horizon scanning, she says this is something they do a lot of, but they feel like, it often feels like people are very familiar with the same set of trends and drivers, and they maybe disengage somewhat when they start to hear about them. So firstly, what do you do about kind of helping people to see that fresh and to relate to it, and to reconsider what it might mean? So that's one question that she's asking. The second piece is really about how do you essentially translate that kind of futures piece into practical actions? Can we help people to understand that there is a cost attached to doing nothing, to preserving the status quo? So those two pieces I think feel really, really important.
Yeah, they are. They're two really good questions and sort of covering different ends of the process. People understand horizon scanning differently. I think there's the traditional practice as it was 10, 20, 30 years ago might have been a bit more slow moving and occasional. Something you would go out and do almost like a literature review, and kind of have it then and that's it. Or you might have a habit of returning back to the same key issues. We've always kind of seen scanning as an ongoing process. It has inflections where you're actually focused on a particular issue, a request or an exploration or a question, but really it's a rolling process that's always occurring. And so in that way, those trends can get reframed and recontextualized on a fairly regular basis, so that you're refreshing the kind of indicators and evidence. You might find that you need to recharacterize or redescribe the trends. So that, and that's really important because it helps your consumer, your stakeholder, whoever's reading this or taking it in, actually kind of sense that change and not just see this as a one-off answer, but that it actually is something dynamic. And that may have a good reinforcement on your own process. The other end of that, in terms of kind of impact and how do you actually connect it to action, that we often kind of want to leave off at the scenario or leave off at the artifact and not go further. But you can actually ask, even with an abstract future, fairly concrete questions. Who are the people we're going to need in this future? Is there particular kinds of knowledge we're going to need, and what is the cost of that? What tools are we going to need? Materials, resources, what networks and alliances and partnerships? All of those things you might ask about a current state issue, or you might use a business model canvas. You can still ask a lot of those questions. The answers might be more abstract, but that gives you a starting point. You can get an order of magnitude of change that's necessary to deal with a particular future. And then you're speaking the language of the organization again. You're back to cost and impact and need, in a useful enough way that you can draw a line between this future and now.
Andrew Bennett has a question which I think is pretty topical. You don't talk a great deal in the book about politics, but of course politicians trade in the business of futures very much. And Andrew's sort of talking about how nostalgia fuel narratives about kind of going back to the past, making America great again, I guess, and a lot of some of the things that the Brexit campaign promoted, have quite a powerful pull. So can you do you have any reflections on the way that futures can be used as a rallying point for alternative points of views to counterbalance that nostalgia?
There's a phrase that we use pretty regularly internally, and that's, it takes a future to fight a future. If you don't like the one that's been presented, particularly if it's an old official future rehashed or a used future, as some people say, then you need to be able to construct an alternative narrative that is strong enough to be compelling and provide a kind of plausible promise. And you're right, we see this with the dominant narratives right now are there because there's a vacuum. I'm halfway through an op-ed about why the US needs a narrative about the future, because both of the offers that are there on the table, make America great again, and even build back better, are still kind of recursive. They're callbacks in a way. They're different, but they're callbacks in a way. Take back control. All of those sorts of narratives are kind of return loops. And what we really need are strong, plausible alternative futures that can be described, modeled, costed and defended at some point as an alternative to that. And so really, I mean, for me, I feel like the entire book has a small political P running
Yes.
through all of it, but in a grounded and useful way.
And there's this idea that has been doing the rounds for a while now, which a question from Nigel Field touches on. So it's this idea that the future's speeding up in some way. And Nigel asked specifically if, do you think the pace of technological change is making the future harder to predict? I know you would question whether prediction is the purpose, of course. But yeah, I'm interested to know whether you think that's true, or humans have always just thought that.
Yeah, I think part of it is a bias and perception issue. I mean, my background in sort of academic is in economic history, and so I've looked backwards a lot to look forwards. And I think, part of it is just kind of the perception of where you stand. Everything seems to be happening. I think one of the issues making it really, sort of intensifying it is we have such transparency now. We can see so much changing, not just on our own doorstep, but around the world, that it compounds it. We have this kind of wall of evidence and artifacts in front of us that makes it seem that way. It's also a narrative of progress that helps sell the idea that we need to change and opens the door for creation of new things. I don't know really. I think there's sort of schools of argument that say, well, actually, phenomenologically, there's not any more happening now than there was, 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago. It just seems like it. But I think it's a perception of change. But also it's really important to recognize that there is a narrative underlying that may benefit certain parties over others.
Mm-hmm. And in a way that perception is probably very much driven by our experience of being inundated with information, which arguably our brains,
right.
has another period in history where we were being asked to filter that much information, and so that can only intensify the feeling that the future is speeding up in some way.
Right, because you can see it everywhere. You can see everyone's future happening simultaneously.
Exactly. You only used to be able to see, yours and your neighborhoods or something. So we've got a question about the extent to which there is still space for stories and for narratives from Oliver. So we obviously, I steered you, it's my fault, because you do talk about this very much in the book, but I steered you towards objects and artifacts, because obviously it's been a dominant theme in the field for a while. But your co-author, of course, is a well-known sci-fi writer, so it's only right to, I think, give a nod to the critical role that plays.
It is, and I think it's, even ourselves as an organization, most of us are writers as well as our other kind of functions as researchers or whatnot. You mentioned Madeline Ashby, my co-author. She's a science fiction novelist and focuses a lot on the use of narrative, but very careful use of narrative. We talk about them as strategic story forms. How can you use narratives as a strategic tool to again, take that form that we're all familiar with culturally and transmit information. And I've used the term folklore earlier. This is something that actually a colleague at Google or a friend at Google mentioned to me a few years ago, because he said we actually need to establish a new folklore around X in the organization. And it's interesting to think about it that way, because we do tell ourselves stories. We tell ourselves stories about what's desirable, what's achievable, and using stories as a way of kind of changing path and bending the path we're on, I think, are quite critical. And those can be deep stories, or they can actually be quite shallow, short stories. And part of the skill here is choosing the right form of story for the right topic or question.
I'm afraid we actually don't have any more time for more questions. So it's all that remains really is for me to thank you so much, Scott, for joining us, and the audience for those questions. It was really, really impressive, fascinating questions. If you'd like to join some of the future events in this series, you can sign up to them on our website. So we've got, appropriately for the discussion we were just having, on the 24th of November, we've got Anne Pettifor, who's the author of The Case for the New Green Deal, and she'll be talking about how you kind of bring about that systems change that's needed to tackle the climate crisis. If you would like to, you can pick up a copy of Scott's book using the discount code, which my colleague will pop in the chat function, but it's also in your confirmation emails for the event. So thanks again, Scott. All that remains is for me to wish his native country the best of luck in tonight's elections. I hope it goes as smoothly as possible, and look forward to seeing all of you again soon.
Thank you.
Bye.